The wrong tomb theory states that the followers of Jesus discovered the tomb to be empty because they went to the wrong tomb. This theory has a number of problems. First, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were at the tomb when Jesus was buried, so they knew which tomb to go to. Second, as if they needed a landmark, Pilate placed a number of Roman soldiers outside the tomb to prevent the body's theft. Third, as mentioned above, even enemies of Christianity said the tomb was empty. Again, we find a theory for which there is no evidence and therefore no reason to believe. The stolen body theory says that Jesus' followers stole his body from the tomb. This particular theory has a great advantage over all other non-resurrection theories. It's the only alternative theory that dates from the 1st century. This theory is actually recorded by the Bible itself, as well as by Jewish tradition, such as the Toledoth Jesu. The weakness of the stolen body theory is that it doesn't account for the behavior of the disciples. The disciples deserted Jesus the night of his arrest. But less than 2 months later, they were publicly preaching in Jerusalem about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. It seems odd that if these cowards stole the body, they would then, within a matter of weeks, turn around to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus so forcefully and with such uniform passion and commitment. But the apostles were so committed to the story of the resurrection of Jesus that most likely all of them, with the exception of John, paid for the claim with their lives by dying martyrs' deaths. The point is that these men scattered around the known world for the sole reason of proclaiming the physical, historical resurrection of Jesus. For the stolen body theory to be true, we would have to believe that these 11 cowardly men overpowered a number of Roman soldiers guarding the tomb, disposed of Jesus' body, and fabricated a story that they all fanatically stuck to, even as they were being crucified, stoned, scourged, beheaded, thrown from buildings, and flayed. Not only that, but they did it for no personal gain whatsoever. The lives of the 11 apostles show absolutely no motive for stealing the body or perpetrating the lie of Jesus' resurrection. There was no prospect of riches in holding to the story, and they were far more infamous than famous. It's true that many martyrs have died for something that was a lie, but no one dies for a story that they made up and know to be a lie. Yet none of the disciples tried to escape execution by admitting to making up the story. The legend theory states that Jesus' burial, the discovery of the empty tomb, and the resurrection appearances are stories devised by the apostles to embody the teachings of Jesus. But if they did invent this story, why would they include so many claims that could be investigated? And why would they make these claims in the one city where they could be investigated and where so many witnesses could refute them? If the plan was to spread a legend, why not base the operation out of Galilee, where the facts couldn't be checked so easily? But perhaps an even bigger problem for this theory is the discovery of the empty tomb by women. In first-century Palestine, women were considered untrustworthy and were not even allowed to testify in a court of law. If the legend was to be convincing, why would the apostles make the discovery of the empty tomb made by witnesses who would not be believed? Why not say it was discovered by one of the leaders, like Peter or John? A variation of the legend theory says enthusiastic followers of Jesus other than the apostles began to tell exaggerated tales of his deeds that developed over the years into the story we now know. The first problem with this version is the ever-present problem of the empty tomb being attested to very early on by enemies of Christianity. The second is the behavior of the apostles that was mentioned earlier. The third is that the apostles would have corrected errors in the false teaching about Jesus. In fact, this is exactly why some of the New Testament books were written, to combat false teachings about Jesus. The New Testament is not the only sacred book that gives an account of the resurrection. The Quran, Islam's holy scripture, tells of the arrest, crucifixion, and resurrection, but it differs significantly from the biblical account. Islam teaches that Jesus never died, but was assumed into heaven. There are a couple of variations explaining how this happened. One version has the soul of Jesus departing from the body before the torture and execution. Jesus was assumed into heaven, but his soulless body was left on earth to be tortured. Another, more popular tradition explains that Judas, unbeknownst to the disciples, made his way to Jesus' prison cell and took Jesus' place, allowing Jesus to escape. God then made Judas to look and sound like Jesus. Thus, the executioners of Jesus only thought they had crucified Jesus. The first problem is that the Quran was written almost 600 years after the event it claims to correctly document. Compare that with the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 9, makes claims of Jesus' death by crucifixion, burial, resurrection on the third day, and resurrection sightings that date back within 1 to 3 years of the crucifixion itself. Given the choice between believing an account 1 to 3 years removed from the event that's confirmed repeatedly by eyewitnesses, and an account 700 years removed from the event that has no corroboration, the burden is very heavily placed on the latter. The problem is even worse for the second variation because it's based on the Gospel of Barnabas, which was written as late as the Middle Ages. This version also includes the disciple stealing the body, which we saw earlier is very problematic. The biblical account of what happened the Sunday after Jesus' execution is supported by the arguments against the theories already mentioned. Points such as the empty tomb being affirmed by first-century enemies of Christianity, the discovery of the empty tomb by witnesses that wouldn't be allowed in court, and the radical change in the behavior of the disciples speak to the truthfulness of the biblical account. In addition, we have to account for the conversion of Saul of Tarsus to the Apostle Paul. Saul was a Pharisee, trained by one of the most eminent rabbis of his day. He also persecuted Christians and was on the road to Damascus to do just that when he became one instead. Something happened that turned his world in the opposite direction. Instead of persecuting Christians, he became the greatest missionary who ever lived. It cost him dearly to make his case that Jesus is the Son of God. He was frequently beaten, jailed, flogged, was shipwrecked several times, and ultimately was beheaded. He forfeited his position of privilege as a Pharisee and probably wealth. This radical change in course is best explained by his own account, a real encounter with the risen Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead is the best explanation of the events on the Sunday after the execution of Jesus. All other explanations fall short in accounting for the evidence we have. They make claims that aren't supported by the evidence, and they lack explanatory power. Thus, the central claim of Christianity makes a strong case for its truthfulness. This line of argumentation can stand on its own as a case for Christianity, or it can be a part of a whole case that uses many arguments to make its case. Either way, its importance could hardly be understated. As Paul said, without the historical resurrection, we have no reason to believe.